Our speaker tonight is Matt Evans, and he is an ecologist at the Chicago Botanic Garden. He's also a volunteer steward and leader in the North Branch Restoration Project located on the north side of Chicago. He's been working in the ecological setting with experienced leaders and ecologists for 4 years. He's earned a bachelor's degree from Loyola University Chicago and a master's from Northwestern University, sorry. Tonight, he'll introduce us to the Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves. It's a new group of volunteer stewards resolved to train new volunteer leaders and create volunteer communities focused on managing nature preserves in Illinois. He'll share some information about prairies with us. He's going to discuss what a remnant prairie is, and he's going to let us know how prairies are doing in Illinois. And through all of this, we'll come to understand why perhaps we should be helping with this. So Matt, we're glad to have you here with us, and we're looking forward to your presentation. One side note, I do want to say that check your emails, because he gave us 4 different handouts and they're very informative. So check those. Thanks, Matt.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you everybody else who is here. So I'm going to share my screen now. I put 2 links in the chat that are links to the website for the organization and then the organization's Facebook page. And those are good places to start that aren't too complicated. And so I'm going to share my screen now. Thank you everybody so much for hosting me tonight to talk to you about the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves. This is a long name, but it is descriptive. The nature preserves in our state are different than the rest of the preserves. They were identified as the highest quality parcels of land left in the 1970s when the surveys of the Illinois Natural History Survey were completed. And these parcels are so important to understanding the rich ecological history of Illinois that they were preserved in perpetuity. For the first time that any parcel of land has legally been protected in perpetuity ever in the world, except perhaps ancient cultural buildings and constructions like the Pantheon, which are obviously preserved in perpetuity. But think about these as our pantheons. And so I think the Illinois Prairie Wild Ones is just a great group that would enjoy hearing about what we are trying to instill in the people of the state. And let me be clear that our focus here is the nature preserves, but it is very much so the people of Illinois as well. And so without further ado, here is our timeline so far. We're a young organization, but the nature preserve system is not incredibly young. It was born in the 50s and came of age in 1963 when it was passed as an act in the Illinois legislature, the Illinois Natural Areas Act, which created the nature preserve system, which was the first in the country and also the first in the world. Illinois has a rich history of conservation that many are unfamiliar with, and I was as well. And it's a pleasure for me to be able to tell you a little bit about that. So between 1963 and 2020, many parcels of land on the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory were preserved or protected through the Natural Areas Act. In 2019, to support needed stewardship of these preserves, the Illinois Nature Preserves, the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves was founded through a collaboration and a sort of statewide poll of the influential conservationists and people who were known through certain circles to care a lot about the nature preserve system, all agreeing that this sort of statewide organization to be a hub was necessary for the nature preserves. The staff and volunteer stewards who are and have been working on the nature preserves until now have been doing heroic work. They just have too much. And so it's time for the rest of the state of Illinois, the constituents of the preserves, to join the force. And so in March 2021, we hired our first employee, an executive director, to make this an official and day in, day out organization. Before that, a couple of us were doing it during graduate school with volunteer stewards who were some exceptionally dedicated people. And now we have hired somebody who is working day in and day out to connect with staff, nature preserve stewards, and others across the state who are invested in the nature preserve system and want to see it thrive. And through our advocacy, one early win was the DNR announcement that they'd be hiring a new nature preserve system director, which was a vacant position starting in 2015. And so 5 or 6 years without a director is a tough spot for any organization. And we're lucky that the nature preserve staff people who work for the INPC, the Illinois Nature Reserve Commission, and the DNR know the sites so well and have been in their roles so long that for the most part, they were able to hold things together. But there are over 600 preserves, and we'll talk about how many staff there are in a minute. And so to start with our mission, we have a clear, easy mission. We are trying to raise the profile of the system through education and advocacy. And it's not just we. There are people just like you out there who are trying to do this, but don't have a centralized organization to help do it through. And so fundraising and facilitating partnerships and promoting and empowering volunteerism are aspects of conservation that are happening across the state, but here we're presenting a centralized organization that is connected with the staff and the preserves to give the people who want to do this work an outlet or an avenue in which to do that. And so through raising the profile, fundraising and facilitating partnerships, and empowering volunteerism, volunteer stewardship specifically, we hope to accomplish the mission of supporting the Illinois nature preserve systems into the future, the Illinois nature preserves and the system. Two quick and important aspects of our mission I want to touch on specifically. The first is that the Friends has promoted and used the model of the work, learn, and lead, or the learn one, do one, teach one aspect of getting this work done. And so through patiently working with people who are interested and explaining to people who might be interested what this work is, we hope to foster volunteer communities that build like, or that grow like a little league or a faith group in any town in Illinois. If any town in Illinois can have a little league or a faith group, it certainly can have a group like the one you're looking at in these photos, where people are learning about the management of the preserves together, enjoying the preserves, and contributing to the health of them. And so one of the big aspects of our mission is this work, learn, and lead approach. We believe that empowerment of regular Illinois people, just like yourselves, just like me, just like I am, we think that by getting to work, by learning, and then eventually leading, that this work can be accomplished by the 12 million people in our state, but not every single one of them. And so by work, learn, and lead, we hope to establish volunteer communities. And then we hope to teach people to have a different relationship with the land and with the preserves and with their yards, with the farm and industrial landscapes that we have across Illinois, understanding that the relationship we have directly impacts the outcomes of the future of these landscapes is an important principle that we're trying to promote. And so who said it better but Aldo Leopold when he said, when we see the land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. And so here we have a picture of something that I find to be a really good example of the goal of volunteer stewardship or stewardship of the land generally. That is, despite the overabundance of deer on much of our landscape, at least around our cities in Illinois, perhaps where Bloomington and Peoria are, the deer are managed differently than in Cook County, where Chicago is. But here in Cook County, in order to get a rare plant to set seed, you have to put a cage around it because the deer will eat it otherwise. And that's just a reality of the stewardship work, which is different across the state. But in Cook County, this work, building a cage like this, will help a plant succeed into the next generation and cover our landscape in prairie lilies or blazing stars, shooting stars. But unfortunately, we do have to do work that is somewhat tedious, but also I see a lot of smiles in this photo. People are having a good time. They're out in nature and they know that they're contributing to the seed set of future rare plants, which leads to my favorite vocabulary word in the English language, formerly endangered species. So if you can cage enough prairie lilies in Cook County, they come back. And so across the rest of the state, initiatives like this are supported by the Friends and by volunteer groups that have learned a bit about the Friends philosophy. So raising the profile of the system so far has been going okay. We're a young organization. We have a great big sister in Illinois Audubon. And Illinois Audubon has been such a great partner to us that we have been able to appear in their magazine and raise the profile of the nature preserves even higher. And so through a constituency like the Illinois Audubon constituency, we hope to grow a network, not another group of people who buy the Illinois Nature Preserves magazine, no. A group of people who are invested in nature preserves and understand their diverse ownership and stewardship. And so through organizations like Illinois Audubon or the Illinois DNR, we are able to promote the Illinois Nature Preserve system, which has always been a part of the equation with supporting the most high quality parcels that are left to us in Illinois. And that is a partnership that is between the public DNR and private other organizations like Illinois Audubon and private citizens of Illinois, many of which who own most of the land in Illinois. And so we have over 600 nature preserves. It's something like 603 as of the last time I checked. There are 9 staff and an additional 9 other staff through DNR, but this is the Illinois Nature Preserve Commission staff bench. It's a short bench of 9 staff. And with a state with 12.6 million people, 600 nature preserves or 600 little leagues or 600 faith communities should be achievable in our state. And we believe that that's the goal we're working toward. So now I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of the mission because nothing explains like pictures. And so here we have a group of volunteers in a woodland that has the typical signs of degradation, invasive species, lack of fire. But the first step is getting together and starting to remove some of the shade, teaching each other how to do it and getting out there and actually doing it. And so through removing invasive species and other sometimes native species that have grown out of control in our ecosystems, like maples in our forests that used to be fire-dependent forests, and maples could not tolerate that fire, we have been able to show the mission and model that we are promoting. And this is what it looks like. It looks like people, regular people together in the woods, bringing their own experiences together, or out in the prairie, bringing their own experiences and sharing with each other knowledge of life and knowledge of ecosystem. And food. Food is generally accepted as a key part of this work. Here, this is a remnant prairie out at Goose Lake Prairie, and I did tell you guys that I would tell you what a remnant prairie is, and I will when we get to a cemetery prairie, because those are some of the truest of the remnants. But here you can see, you know, someone stepping carefully between what might look like just a group of grasses and other plants, but understanding what they're looking at, this person is trying to step between them, knowing that this little parcel of land right here is very much endangered. But you see the other group of people collecting seeds here and looking at the seeds in order to perpetuate and expand this plant community that has grown so rare in our region. And that plant community isn't just about the plants, it supports numerous insect, animal, and ultimately at one time did support human beings through herbal medicines that the prairie was more full of than the woodlands, and the grazing of large ungulates like bison, elk, deer, that the Native Americans who stewarded this land for thousands of years survived on before. And so it might look like a plant community, but it is much more than that. The people community is what the Friends believes will make the difference. The Friends organization is geared toward people. Yes, there's a rich understanding in many of the founders and the leaders with Friends in the ecology of the region. But there is also almost an expertise in volunteer organization and in volunteer empowerment, which is different than other organizations across the state who see sometimes volunteers as more work to manage, just like the land. But the Friends model is that the people of Illinois need to be empowered to take care of the prairies, woodlands, and savannas, wetlands, ponds, swamps, in order for these places to actually survive into the future. It can't possibly be 9 staff people, a couple of volunteer stewards, and several organizations taking care of it. That's not enough. We have 12 million people here. Everybody wants to do something about climate change or the environment or pollution or extinction or biodiversity loss, or they just want to be outside. And the Friends is trying to capitalize on that. The Friends are trying to capitalize on that need and want, desire for engagement with the natural landscape and getting to know Illinois a little better. So community empowerment can lead to incredible transformations of the landscape. Many hands make for light work, they say. The work is never truly light in this field. The amount of work ahead of us is extreme, but it is also very inspiring and truly something that many people are finding themselves enjoying doing. And so ecological restoration is done by professionals like myself at the Chicago Botanic Garden and the DNR, Illinois Audubon, all over the state. I do not think that the professionals will make a big enough difference and that volunteer stewards will. And so that is where the Friends sort of draws the line and says, if we don't do this, if we stay below this line, we will not succeed in saving the nature preserves from invasive species, for example. But if we are able to instill a sense of community and empower that community through preserving and stewarding the nature preserve system and the actual species within the nature preserves will thrive into the future. And so here are just a few pictures of some nature preserves. This is a healthy nature preserve in a woodland where we can see oaks reproducing, which is not true everywhere in Illinois anymore because of the amount of shade. Here's a picture of a volunteer steward at a woods. Yes, there's a little bit of a tree hugger photo, but at the same time, this is a group of people who got together on the weekend in the winter to be in the woods and to support the oak reproduction by removing some of the shade from unnaturally overabundant species that are really there because there hasn't been fire for 100 years. And so we can talk more about the ecology, but today I'd really like to present to you the human aspect. And I'm happy to answer questions about ecology anytime. Just interrupt me, or if you can, wait till the end. Like I said, food is a very important part of this work because food is a very important part of any human community. And it turns out that food and sharing food with each other is one of those super connectors. It can really very strongly connect people because there's a lot of effort that goes into making food, and the volunteer communities that get together oftentimes find themselves even more strongly connected because there's coffee or there's chili. But back to volunteer stewardship and not volunteer cooking. Here are some pictures of people having a good time in the preserves together. Yes, they're wearing masks because there were mask mandates in the Cook County Forest Preserves where this photo was taken, where some volunteers are picking little bluestem, which is a classic prairie plant and really contributes to the health of any nature preserve where it is appropriate, a prairie. And so the pictures here that you see are just more photos of people who are doing stewardship related activities. Over here on the right, this is a seed processing workday or a seed cleaning workday. After collecting seeds, many of them need to be separated from the stems and the leaves. And so those seeds are pushed through a sieve of different size and collected in a tub underneath and then put into a seed mix later for dispersal into the ecosystem, where they turn out to actually be the key to ecosystem restoration. And seeds turn out to also be the key to people understanding what they're looking at when they're in the preserves. By seed picking, you can both learn, work, and lead, or all three of those things. By learning, you can learn a lot about the ecology of plants and then also about what we're looking at when we're in an ecosystem or a nature preserve. Some people say, oh, the green blur or plant blindness, but truly growing plant love occurs and growing plant knowledge occurs through seed picking more than any other activity that I've seen. Because seed picking really makes you look for a certain trait or a certain structure, and you can find it out there, and then you can learn a story about it. You can learn what it looks like in different seasons, and then you can start to understand where you might put that seed based on where you picked it. And so those ecological and connection type experiences really inform and teach people how to teach each other through seed picking and seed cleaning. Much of our winter work in Illinois is removing trees. Many of these trees are invasive, like honeysuckle, and many of these trees are native that are become overabundant. We are from the prairie state, and so my background right now is a painting of a prairie on which there are 0 trees. I'm not saying that trees are a bad thing. I'm saying that the ecosystems that have evolved in Illinois and are some of the most biodiverse in the world evolved without many trees. And it is our job as stewards of the land to perpetuate those ecosystems for the future generations of people who are going to live in Illinois and try to understand what they're looking at. And so the prairie and savanna ecotypes are very much the fabric of Illinois. And much of the work, which you see people smiling doing here, is cutting down trees because they know they're going to seed these areas with savanna species as they transition back into grasslands. So here are some more pictures of people working together. Much of this work is done well as a team. Here's a beautiful picture of Marsh Marigold, a plant that everybody should have in a wet spot of their yard if they can. Here are some more photos. I'm showing you all of these photos to demonstrate people out in the preserves and what that looks like, so that you can see yourself doing it. Because sometimes people worry that, oh, what will I do out in the preserves? Won't there be ticks? And I'm worried about mosquitoes, but none of these people look worried about mosquitoes and ticks to me. They're all having a good time in the tall grass prairie, or a savanna ecosystem type in this case. Removing brush and reintroducing fire to many of the nature preserves is the number one best thing we can do. That's removing shade and adding fire. Those count as one thing, because what they're doing is recreating the ecosystem structure that used to be there. And so here on the right side, this is the old plank road prairies. This is a right-of-way on the side of a bike path that used to be a railroad. And there is remnant prairie existing there. And I'm still not going to tell you quite yet what a remnant prairie is. If you aren't quite sure yet, we'll get there. These are some things you might see in a remnant prairie and not elsewhere. This is the Indian paintbrush, Castanea coccinea, and the shooting star, which has recently gone through a name change, but I'm still calling Dodecatheon. Lewis and Clark said the shooting stars led them across the Midwest. Prescribed fire is something that we promote through the Friends of the Nature Preserves as the most impactful ecological management that can be done. Prescribed fire is recreating the conditions under which these prairie ecosystems went through every spring or every fall. There would have been Native Americans lighting fires in addition to wildfires. Due to our climate and the precipitation levels late in the year, the August and September droughts would have often ended in landscape scale fires. And the plants and animals adapted to that. Many people say that the prairie is the rainforest upside down, because most of the biodiversity is with the Franklin ground squirrels and the snakes and the 12-foot root systems with every kind of insect you can imagine in them. And these fires were not bad for the landscape and still are the best thing that we can do for the landscape. Removing invasive species is arguably the next most important thing, but typically most invasive species cannot handle the fires that the ecosystem uses as a natural disturbance to keep itself in check and to weed out all the plants that are intolerant of it. So here, this is another example of what Friends volunteers are doing safely, professionally. And so currently, a year in, there are 7 preserves in which the Friends group is working, and we are eager to partner with more preserves across the Illinois Nature Preserve system. So right now, there are several preserves that we are supporting and trying to help expand volunteer communities at, one of which, before the pandemic, we were trying to work with some wonderful people at the Parklands Foundation to understand the volunteer stewardship community there and what we might be able to contribute in a learn and lead type seminar at Chinkapin Bluffs Land and Water Reserve, which is a beautiful, amazing place on the Mackinac River. And so nearby you, as you can see in the Bloomington and Peoria area, there are several nature preserves. They are spread out more than other preserve types, and that's because they are the highest quality preserves. Not everywhere in the state was biodiversity surviving in its complete community, or somewhat complete community. And so the nature preserves do tend to be a little bit spread out. They follow some of the hill prairies of the Illinois River in your region, but they have diverse ownership that presents many opportunities for collaboration with everything from park districts to the state to private landowners. So here I will tell you now about Remnant Prairies. Remnant Prairies are very special places, and Short Pioneer Cemetery Nature Preserve is one of them. At Short Cemetery, the Short family buried their deceased family members and community members at this cemetery, which in about 150 years ago had almost no trees around it. It was a big open savanna type ecosystem, so there were some trees around. But because this place was a culturally respected area, a cemetery, this was never plowed into a cornfield or mined for coal, which is two of the typical land uses in this region near Coal City, Illinois, in Grundy County. And so the fabric of Illinois, really the prairie, survived here. It had become grown up in trees, shaded from the leaves and large branches of trees that grew for over a century. And volunteers in the neighborhood decided that they wanted to come and help. And so we removed those trees over this 1 acre preserve over 2 winters. And now the sunlight reaching the floor of the prairie here, the soils of the prairie, again, is rejuvenating a prairie ecosystem that you can't just bring back in an agricultural field. The components of the ecosystem, the plants, the insects, particularly of this remnant, are there. They're just hanging on in low numbers. And so when the shade was removed and the fires reintroduced, the volunteers even had more seeds to pick, more species of seeds to pick, because those species responded positively to the opening up of the canopy and the return of the fire to the landscape. And so a remnant prairie is a place that has never been plowed for corn or soybeans or wheat. It has never been farmed. It has, in some cases, been used to some degree, like this one where people were interred a long time ago. But for the most part, many remnant prairies have suffered very little disturbance. And so the soil biota, the insects, and the plants are usually present in greater numbers or in a greater representation of the whole community than in other places where you might see what you would call nature. So here in the remnant prairies, we find the real deal, the true remnants of the Illinois landscape from which we garner invaluable resources like educational resources and the actual genetic diversity of these prairie plants. And so we won't dive too much into genetics or anything, but remnant prairies are very important because these prairies tend to represent the evolutionary history of Illinois. Middle Fork Savannah Nature Preserve is a beautiful place that is a preserve where you can truly see the landscape of Illinois on that level. It's 700 acres of mixed prairie and savanna, where volunteers have started removing shade from the most high quality areas where prairie plants are still growing underneath trees, which is one way we know that a place or an area or a parcel of land used to be prairie and is now being shaded out by trees. Sometimes we find a plant like prairie dock growing underneath a tree. Prairie dock can grow and live for over 100 years. And so it doesn't give up right away and is a great indicator of what may have been there many, many years in the past. And that can clue us in to what we are supposed to restore there, or what would the land support. is another way to say it, which in many cases in Illinois is prairie. And so here you can see volunteers mixing up seeds that they collected all summer and all fall. And in the winter, when the snows are there and the ground is frozen and thawing and frozen and thawing, we plant the seeds, which then plant themselves through the freeze and thaw cycle. At Middle Fork, we also cage plants. We've been teaching volunteers there to cage plants in order to collect seeds from them later, like you see in these two photos. Cages lead to seeds, because otherwise deer will get the plants and they won't set seed. And in remnant prairies, that is a very big deal because those seeds represent the genetic legacy of an entire landscape since the glaciers. And before that, truly, when all the plants, you can imagine a glacier pushing everything south. Many of our prairie plants went down into Texas and Mexico to spend about 100,000 years in the warm, well, what would have been more like the Illinois landscape back then, and climate. But then they moved back north after the last glacier. And so here, the old plank road prairies, there was 17 miles of railroad between Joliet and Chicago, on which either side exists about 30 feet of remnant prairie that has had very little degradation over time. And so those prairies are burned every year by volunteer stewards. And if they had not been doing that for the last 30 years, I would never have seen these prairies. They would have grown up in trees, and they would have shaded out prairie lilies, prairie gentians, yellow stargrass. You know, it's a fairy tale when we start talking about the names that were given to these organisms, but it is inspiring and it's fun to restore these species and find shooting stars underneath a thicket of buckthorn, and to save that patch of shooting stars from that buckthorn. It's a pretty satisfying activity. And here we have a picture of a group of people planning the next workday at the end of a current workday. In Chicago, or in the Chicago area, but also northwest of here, not as much in the Peoria, Bloomington area, we have an ecosystem called a fen. A fen is a gravel hill out of which the bottom, there is a seep of calcareous or calcium-rich water, which supports a very different plant community that is unique to the fen ecosystem type. And so the fens across the state are growing up in trees and invasive species as well, due to lack of fire. And the advent of what no one in the 1960s and 50s saw coming, which was the amount and the aggressive nature of invasive species. This is a concept we call the shifting baseline, which is familiar to many people, but that is that when I learned about the nature preserves, they looked very different than when the nature preserves were originally dedicated or the law was passed. There were no fields of teasel on the highway. Phragmites did not dominate every wetland with reed canary grass and purple loosestrife. Those invasive species are newer on the landscape, and the ecosystems that are ancient in our landscape, like these fens, really need our help in order to deal with those invasive species. And so here again, we have people in the preserves, not the preserves alone dealing with invasive species by themselves. Langham Island is a great example of where the well-meaning people of the DNR and the Nature Preserve Commission preserved Langham Island and basically said, let's leave it alone. It has the rare Kankakee mallow, along with an incredible array of rare Illinois species that survive on this one island in the Kankakee River. But ultimately, in retrospect, doing nothing was not the best idea because the native redbud trees and the invasive honeysuckle took over the island and almost completely killed the Kankakee mallow, which grows nowhere else in the world. And so Through volunteer-led restoration, the island has been opened up again, seeded with oak savanna species, and the Kankakee mallow, after many fires, has come back and has started to thrive again. And volunteers will actually be collecting seeds of that species in the next few weeks in order to redistribute them across the island more widely. That has been happening now for 3 years. If you want to be a part of that, the Friends of Langham Island Facebook page is a good place to look to start. But people made the difference here. That's the main goal. And look, it's just regular people drawing regular maps of the island. This isn't some fancy computer program. This is not a cartographer's drawing. This is just a volunteer. And I mean just a volunteer in the most powerful sense. Volunteers and people doing things voluntarily have always made the greatest difference in the world. And so here we are at Langham Island. The community of neighbors at Langham Island is taking care of the honeysuckle and seeding the Kankakee mallow and reintroducing the fires. And they are even making maps of their progress to coordinate and to make sure that biodiversity and ecosystem processes are being cared for. Positive outcomes at Langham Island have been a true highlight for biodiversity conservation in the state. And this is not just a Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves initiative. The DNR, the people who live around the Kankakee River State Park, where Langham Island is located, have all contributed equally to this work, and ultimately to saving this preserve from the slow, painful death of shade that is what occurs to these ecosystems. And so here, I just included a little video of what the Langham Island volunteers developed. It's called a rolling bonfire. It turns out that our ecosystems are so fire dependent that a little heat on the soil can really make some species germinate. And one of those species is the Kankakee mallow. And so after a bonfire like this one, where the volunteers roll it around at sort of a lower temperature than a big roaring bonfire, you can stimulate the Kankakee mallow to germinate. And in rows like this, the Kankakee mallow has been germinating and coming back. And so through creative initiatives like the rolling bonfire and seed picking and cage building and field seminars talking about the sites, training and mentorship have emerged as one of the focuses of the Friends of the Nature Preserves in order to train people to do this work in a way that is actually effective. And so many professionals have weighed in and agreed that the practices used and taught by the Friends of the Nature Preserves are good ones. They will work if they are followed and perpetuated into the future. And so here we have some people building cages, 2 volunteers working together to herbicide brush in a prairie where, you know, a dogwood colony might shade out a bunch of rare prairie plants like with fun names, even like bastard toadflax or prairie gentian or purple prairie clover, edible valerian. There are so many interesting plants in our state because of the diversity of our rich temperate grassland ecological history. Here's a video that I like to include because many people say, oh, well, you're going into these super rich, very special preserves and you're using harsh chemicals that kill everything. Well, here's an example of a technique where you can avoid the rare phlox, which is the white flower you see in the background, and you can still apply herbicide to the invasive species, in this case, an ornamentally planted yucca, which is very easy to hand wipe. And so by teaching people who have pesticide licenses or herbicide licenses, and we're advocating for more people to have an easier time getting those licenses through the state, we can teach people how to appropriately manage a rare ecosystem, which is not just going out there and haphazardly spraying pesticides, which most people sometimes associate with ecological restoration work. But here, that's an example of a very targeted, very effective method for managing invasive species. And so for the Friends of the Nature Preserve, some of our short-term goals are to do presentations like this, community meetings where we try to explain and share with people what we're doing. And so for prairie conservation and ecosystem conservation, specifically around the nature preserves in our state, it's going to require people understanding what's going on. And so in our short-term goals, we really focus on this work because I think it'll make a big difference if more people are involved in the long run. And the only way to really get more people involved is to try to organize them and tell them about what they need to be involved in if they want healthy nature preserves for the future. And so getting more people involved through seed picking, especially this time of year, if you are the volunteer steward of a nature preserve, seed picking is one of the best things that you can be doing this time of year to learn the plants, but to also get people involved, because there's nothing like filling up a bag with prairie seeds or filling up a little tiny bag with little tiny seeds, because that might not be the heaviest bag in the world, but it is one of the most important bags in the world, the prairie would think. And so seed picking and getting people involved through seed picking this time of year is a really great approach that if anyone needs any help with at their preserve, they just need to reach out to the friends through the website or through Facebook, and we'll be able to do as much as we can to help get more people involved, that is. So here, more people smiling and working on nature preserves. This is Langham Island again, where brush is being removed. And here's our long-term goal. I didn't create some fancy graph, I just created a simple one because the idea is also simple. And that is more constituency year after year for the nature preserve system. That is measured in preserves with volunteer groups, towns with a little league for the nature preserve. Across Illinois, over time, if this number is growing, the friends and the nature preserves and the DNR and the owners of nature preserves, like I think in the Peoria area, the Peoria Park District, and in the Bloomington area, the Parklands Foundation have really stepped up in order to grow prairie love or grow ecological concern about the nature preserves, which many people have indicated are suffering from invasive species encroachment and the lack of prescribed fire. And ultimately, we would add lack of constituency. The preserves were preserved. They put a fence around many of them and locked it up and said, stay out of here, it's too important. If you go in there trampling things, you're just going to cause damage. But that is a paradigm we are attempting to shift across the country and across Illinois specifically right now through the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves. Here's another picture of some of the interesting things volunteers are doing. Here's another picture of a rolling bonfire in a Kankakee mallow. This plant only grows in Illinois, so take pride in it. Iliamna remota, which is the Kankakee mallow. And here, a savanna ecosystem very typical of most of Illinois. And so here, this is a picture of what most people might not think of what Illinois looks like. But when I think of Illinois, after being involved for 5 or 6 years in this work, I now think of Illinois like this. I think of it as a rich and beautiful, absolutely stunning landscape. And so with that, I'd like to just recap that the most important things for this landscape in the state are people who care, people who show up, people who work, learn, and lead together. They're usually having an amazing time, so much fun, even if it's 3 hours once a month on the weekend. The preserve benefits from that work and that time, and more often than not, in almost every single case, the human community around these preserves grows a very special bond, and that bond is what's going to help the nature preserves into the future. I don't want to sound like I'm preaching. I just want to say that I think that the number one way to serve the ecosystems and to serve the planet, creation, biodiversity, climate change, is to form human communities around these preserves. The person who recently wrote a book about the nature preserve system called Force of Nature, his name is Arthur Melville Pearson, is a pretty well-known author in conservation. And his advice to us as the Friends of the Illinois Nature Preserves was to connect everything to people. George Fell, the founder of the Illinois Nature Preserve system, understood that well, and it's our duty to extend that legacy into the future, because he was right. People are the key. They always have been. Nature was never left alone in Illinois. The Native Americans stewarded the land through fire, the use of fire mostly, in order to perpetuate an ecosystem that is appropriate for this climate, this location on the earth, and for the needs of the people. And so we still have those needs, and we still need these landscapes. And so with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I can turn my presentation off, or I can leave up this beautiful picture of a savanna, whatever anybody thinks is best. But thank you so much for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Friends of the Nature Preserves. We're a new organization, mostly volunteer at this point, but hoping to grow quickly and to make a big difference.
Thank you, Matt. That was so very interesting. And feel free to leave up this very beautiful photo that you have on your screen. And we do have some questions in chat, so I will just jump right in. Tanya is wondering if your friends have thought about linking arms with the birding community and herbalist community who have also who have an interest in maintaining and preserving Illinois' nature preserves.
Yes, absolutely. And where I'm located in the Chicago area, this is a very important group to connect with, because many of the natural resources in our forest preserves and nature preserves in this region are over extracted because of the sheer number of people. And so education and raising awareness about appropriate levels of collection, and where you cannot collect. For example, a nature preserve is not really for collecting anything. Nature preserves are protected with the strongest legislation that has ever been written in land preservation in the world, which I mean, if you'd like to pick my brain a little bit more about, we can talk about that. But the nature preserves are not foraging areas, and helping people understand the difference between a nature preserve and a place where you can forage, because there are so many places even adjacent to nature preserves where foraging and activities that maybe herbalist communities might be more attracted to are still valid activities. Just understanding where the line is between nature and people, and also understanding how humans can benefit through harvest or negatively impact through harvesting natural resources, especially in this ecotype that is very, very rare. For example, harvesting might not seem like a big deal in the rainforest or the forest preserves, for two very different examples, but there's about 50% of the rainforest left, and there's about 1/100th of 1% of the prairie left. So all of the golden seal and the wild ginseng is already gone, and that's because of a lack of understanding of over harvesting natural resources. And so when it comes to connecting with communities that are hoping to make use of natural resources in that way, I personally am very excited to get involved, because I think that that community of people in Illinois deserves to do the best they can for the land. And I think they all have that in their heart when they're out there collecting mushrooms or anything that they're collecting. And so just understanding a little better what's going on is a huge opportunity for the Friends.
Thanks, Matt. Tanya is also interested in, or is asking what efforts are being made to bring the Friends vision to the younger generation through connections with schools, teachers, students, homeschoolers.
Yes, so that's a great question, and I'd like to talk about that for a second, for a minute maybe. And that is, so we are reaching out to anyone in any community that wants to be involved. Most of the time, the little ones come with their parents or their guardians, and in that, the guardians are the ones who have to show up with a child, and so we really do reach out not as much to children. But when children are present at work days, they are some of the #1 focus points because kids really are the future. And there is only one thing that matters about a kid in a nature preserve, and that is whether or not they had a good experience or a bad experience. And so if a kid is pulling a mushroom or digging a hole in a nature preserve, that kid does not get yelled at. That kid is maybe told why they can't dig a hole, but at the same time, that kid's allowed to dig a hole. Because a positive memory in a developmental stage of your life might lead to a forever constituent, a constituent of the nature preserves that will grow into a true leader and someone who cares more than anyone else about the nature preserve. But if a kid gets yelled at for digging a hole, they might never come back, and that's a whole lifetime.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So Kathy is asking if you could share with us the efforts to expand outside the Chicago area into other parts of the state. I know you mentioned a little bit about parklands, but could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure.
Where you're extending outside of the Chicago area.
Absolutely. So yes, we started this organization in the Northeast, but we were going to expand, rapidly, but COVID. So we were slowed down just a little, but not too much, because the outdoor industries, which maybe you could not consider us an industry, but the conservation world did not suffer quite as much as maybe the restaurant world or some other example like that in the state. So expanding from the Northeast has been a two-part strategy. The first part is the staff. There are 9 staff people across the state. If they do not care for what we are doing, we're done right away. So the first strategy was to spend almost a whole year getting to know the staff, building trust, building a relationship with the DNR and the Illinois Nature Preserve Commission staff. Because the Illinois Nature Preserve Commission staff are the ones who know where the volunteer communities are. They know the preserves that are going to be good ones to start with. They understand the problems and the solutions, and so we focused on staff first. That being said, I made a connection with someone at the Parklands Foundation last year and was able to come down and do a workday at Chinkapin Bluffs. We have initiatives started in Southern Illinois, and we're currently fundraising for someone like myself to work in Southern Illinois on an almost full-time basis to promote volunteer stewardship communities. We are currently like $10,000 away from supporting that position. And by connecting Northern and Southern Illinois, we hope to fill in the middle in the coming years, but it does not have to happen in that order. We are a very much an opportunistic, low-hanging fruit organization at the moment. Only one person is getting paid. So anywhere anyone wants us, we're going to be. And so if anyone has any ideas about expanding the work, learn, lead model at their nature preserve, which is a place where volunteers would be empowered to do the ecological restoration work and invite others to do it with them, we are there. We'll be there, because that is exactly what we are trying to promote, and we will help anyone who's trying to do that. But yes, we focused on the staff first in order to strategically make some inroads that will be beneficial in the future in a more expansive way. We think that if we didn't go directly to the staff, we would have a harder time. And so we went to the staff first.
That makes sense. So Jim has a question around tree removal equipment, and he's wondering if your group is planning on buying a Fecon forestry head mounted to a machine. He's indicated that the Friends of the Middle Rock Conservancy bought this machine to get rid of trees in natural areas.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the answer to that question is about people. While the machine that you mentioned is an incredible landscape trait changer, so are people. And many hands make for light work. And we would argue, well, not light work, more work in some cases. And so we at the Friends promote work that the Middle Rock group is doing. Bill Kleinman is a huge supporter of ours, and we are a supporter of everything that Bill has been doing through his career in conservation. But no, we do not have plans to buy forestry equipment of that scale. We are interested in training people on chainsaw and regular hand saws in order to host work days to build community around the preserves and slowly chip away at the woodlands that are encroaching the prairies or other woody growth that would be removed through any mechanical means like chainsaw or a giant machine that's much larger than a chainsaw. But I think the real point is that yes, you could get it all done with a giant logging operation. Sure. But the work, learn, lead model would not be supported in such an activity. You would not be able to teach the kids that are home from college for winter break, or the people who are working down the street at any number of stores and other folks who live in the neighborhood, what's going on and why throughout a workday if we were to do everything in a logging type way. There are certainly areas where the best thing for the nature preserve is if there was a logging operation. That is definitely true. But in building volunteer communities, training on some smaller scale tools, how to use them and why, and then how to spend the time together on site is really the key. So it's more about, it is about getting the trees off the prairie, but it is also about getting people on the prairie to get the trees off the prairie, because that's how you build the community around it. And if everyone knew that, Jack was going around cutting down the trees on the prairie and that's healthy and everything was good and everyone was good for it, but then Jack's the only one doing it with the big logging machinery, that's not necessarily representative of the entire mission of building constituency for the preserves. But that's a great question because we have so much work to do. We believe that we should do it by hand because it builds relationship. But there's a time and a place for a logging operation.
So I have a question. During your presentation, you showed several pictures and we're talking about seed collection and then redistributing the seeds in the prairie areas. Is there a reason why you are opting to do reseeding as opposed to planting like root plugs to help germinate plants for that particular space?
Yeah, sure. Totally. I love answering this question because I love growing native plants. And so growing native plants is very satisfying to me. And here's the thing, I do a lot of that, but I believe in seed mixes because the seed mixes are a way to get many more species out there and seeds of those species. And the seeds can figure out where they want to be. And then through seeding, you can start to hone in or calibrate your seed mixes to figure out where certain species will survive, whether or not they like it wet or sunny or dry or shady. But we have learned, I've only been involved a short time, but volunteers who have been involved a long time have learned that some species don't come up from the seed mix. So there are spaces and there's room for people to be growing these rare native plants. And one of the best things that we can do for the prairie is the prairie lily, for example, a very rare plant now. You have to grow that one from seed and then get it out into the preserve, and then it can set seed itself. And for some reason, there's something we don't know about seeding it, but it knows itself. And so once you get it out there, it can do it more. And importantly for prairie lilies, at least in the region up here in the Northeast where the deer are extremely overabundant, you have to cage them, and they won't come back. But that's a great question, because do we plant plants or do we seed plants? Well, mostly we seed plants.
Yeah. Well, that is all of the questions that we have in chat. We want to thank you again, Matt, for taking the time to share all of this wonderful information and the wonderful work the Friends is doing here in Illinois to preserve our natural prairie areas. And in chat, I uploaded all of the documents that you shared with us, and we can make sure that we send them out again with the link to the recording. So thanks again, everyone, for spending this evening with us and learning more about the Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves. And everyone have a great evening.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's a pleasure.